speaker is Brian Hocket. Brian's coming to us from the Bakersfield area. Brian's the district manager for the Kern West Resource Conservation District. And Brian has been there, he says, since 1988. So you have seen a lot of changes in your years in Kern County as the district manager for the Research Conservation District. Part of his responsibilities in the district is to oversee the operation of a mobile irrigation lab that goes out and works with farmers to evaluate irrigation systems throughout Kern County and all the way up the valley up towards Madera. So Brian's going to talk to us again about how water is evenly applied across the field during irrigation and describing the importance of good irrigation distribution uniformity. So thank you, Brian. We look forward to your presentation.
I'm going to talk about why a good DU is important. So I'm going to get away from all the things that you're used to hearing about as far as nutrients, fertilizer, and all the research that goes on. If a system isn't operating efficiently, all the trials and tests that you're doing are kind of moot, almost. But what I want to talk about is why a good DU is important, how to achieve a good DU, briefly explain the process of doing an evaluation, and look at the results of the work we've done over the last 30 years. But first I want to ask you a question. I want you to think about it during my presentation. Do you think that system uniformity is important? And do you talk to your growers about DU? Or, if you're a grower, are you concerned about DU? Now, most of the work performed by the mobile lab is here in Kern County, but I regularly travel as far north as Madera. I provided training in Yolo County, done work in Stockton, as well as Pilot Hill, east of Sacramento, and I've gone over to the desert side to Ridgecrest and Rosamond. So I'm all over the place. The mobile lab performs on-farm irrigation system evaluations, and that process generates a DU. I get my buttons pushed here, or distribution uniformity, which is the uniform application of water over the entire area being irrigated. DU can be determined by a couple of different methods, the most common of which is the low quarter method, which uses the average of the low quarter over the average of the whole, versus Christensen's coefficient of uniformity, which incorporates standard deviation, where you take the average deviation from the average depth applied divided by the overall average depth applied. For the operation of the mobile lab, here locally, we've been using the low quarter method for the last 30 plus years, and it's worked well for our situation. And I think most of the mobile labs in the state are using the low quarter method as well. Over the years, we've looked at just about every type of system out there. You're getting a lot of different crops, not all of which are mentioned here, but this list comprises the majority of crops that have been included. The generality of trees and vines under microsprinkler covers a lot as well. During that time frame, the lab has conducted a total of almost 3,400 irrigation evaluations. Not all of them at different locations, as we have gone back to some for follow-up at the request of the grower. And I have some growers that are interested in looking at how their systems are performing on an annual basis. So I go back every year. I've been doing that for one grower for over 10 years. As you can see by the numbers, most tests have been conducted in microsystems. And for good reason, as a lot of farmers have converted and continue to convert from surface irrigation to pressurized systems, or micro. Conversions have taken place because there are a lot of advantages to microsystems. Some being obvious, as you can see in this comparison of drip versus surface irrigation. In surface irrigation, as the water is being applied to the field, it's in contact with the soil surface at the head end for a longer time than at the tail end. And this is called opportunity time. And you can see how the amount of water available to the tree varies from one end to the other. So the obvious advantage here is how uniformly the water is being applied under the drip scenario, which is very important when considering not only how much water the plant receives, but also the amount of fertilizer and other constituents that are applied through the water. Some other advantages include potential water savings, where conveyance loss Evaporation, runoff, and deep percolation are minimized. It can be minimized. Weed and disease control. Systems can be automated. Fertilizer and chemicals, as you know, can be applied in the water through the system itself. And you can have improved production on marginal or hilly terrain, operating with little or no runoff. So what's involved in an evaluation? What does it take to generate a DU? It all starts with a field evaluation of the irrigation system, which begins at the filter station. There's a lot of different filter stations, such as this, which is an overflow screen. Might use this on some small acreage, and all you have is a little bit of algae coming through from the district, and you don't want to spend a lot of money on filters, but still be able to clear away the muck that comes in the line. Or maybe you're still on a small acreage, but you have a well, and you're putting a lot of sand out, and so you might use a centrifugal sand separator. Now, when I first started, I saw a lot of these screen filters, but they seem to be on the way out. And I've seen an increase in the number of disc filters. I don't see a lot of disc filters in Kern County, more so in other counties, but there are a number of them here, but not, and there are more of these than the first three I just mentioned. But many of the systems I look at in Kern County utilize sand media filters, which do a fairly good job of filtering out the garbage that comes in the water, as long as they're maintained properly. But regardless of the system, for our purposes, it starts with a pressure check before and after the filters to determine if they are functioning properly, as well as before and after any manual valves and other screens that may be present, such as the cone screen. Can't see the cone screen, but it's between those two flanges that the gentleman in the picture is working on. This screen is supposed to catch anything that gets through the filters. So if sand or whatever comes through, the cone screen is going to catch that sand so it doesn't get in the system and plug up a lot of emitters. Then, once everything is checked to the filters, we got to the field and start checking pressures in the hose lines. This is done at various locations, which include at least 3 spots on each individual manifold. The system may have only one manifold, it's a small one, or as many as 30, depending on how big it is. The biggest one I've looked at was over 600 acres. It had 32 sand media filters, all running at once, and it took me all day to complete. Typically, a manifold will have a pressure regulating valve, as you can see in the diagram, either manual or automatic, where the water enters from a main line or submain and is fed to the individual hose lines. This may be in the center or more towards one end or the other, depending on the topography. Then at each end, there should be a flush out to keep the lines clean. So we check pressure at the regulating valve and the flush outs in order to determine if there's any pressure loss. Not as critical in a pressure compensating system unless it gets below the manufacturer's minimum amount required for maintaining consistent flow. Consistent pressure is more critical in a non-compensating system, such as a micro sprinkler, where flow is directly proportional to the pressure. We also check some hose ends for loss there as well. And sometimes, in the process of going through this evaluation, we see some things that really are baffling. Like a situation where I was in the middle of a test and came to a flush out at the end of a manifold and measured only 2 pounds of pressure. Well, obviously this was a problem because pressure of the regulating valve was 22 psi. So I opened the flush out to try and clean out the line with no effect. Took the hose line off the riser to see if there was anything there. Nothing. I could not find a single thing that was impacting the flow to that line. It stayed at 2 psi. Frustrated and not being able to find what the problem was, I finished the test and wrote up the report indicating the anomaly that I had encountered and gave it to the grower. A couple months later, I was delivering a report for another test to the same grower, and he told me to go out and look on the porch. I thought that was kind of odd, because he said he found the cause of the low pressure problem. It was a tubophore that had become lodged in the manifold. Apparently, it was used as a block in the stack of pipe prior to installation, and during the process, somehow it got into the pipe, becoming an effective plug once the system had water in it. So you never know what you're going to find in the field. Anyway, after we checked all the pressures, we then catch water at different locations based on a high, medium, and low pressure, whether it's in micro sprinklers like this. And here, you can see over the sprinkler, we're using what's called a mad bee, because it makes the sound of a bee with a rotating sprinkler as it hits the inside of the container. Or maybe it's in a drift system like this in a vineyard. As we're catching water, we need to measure it. So this is what generates the DU. But while taking all these measurements and developing these numbers, we're also looking for any problems we might find in the orchard or vineyard or wherever we might be. So these problems that may impact the overall performance. Some of these things we observed at the filter station, like pump pressure, dirty filters, while the rest are out in the field, such as in the regulating valves. Are they covered with dirt, indicating to me that the irrigator may not be checking them very often. Sometimes the box is completely full of dirt because of gophers that have come up underneath while digging, or the box might be full of water, indicating a leak that may need to be addressed. Maybe the emitters are plugged, or the flow is hampered in some manner like this one with algae all over it. A lot of them are completely plugged, and instead of replacing it, the irrigator in a lot of cases comes along and puts a new one right next to the plugged one. Then, when the grower figures out he needs to incorporate acid or some line cleaner in the system, it ends up cleaning out a number of the plugged ones, and you have two right next to each other, effectively discharging twice the amount of water that was originally intended. Or maybe it's a micro sprinkler with gunk. This is a pretty bad one, and a lot of them in the same block were like this, but I don't see them like this very often. But obviously it can happen. I've even heard of situations where if you have prostrate spurge in the field, ants will take the seed, climb up the riser, and push it down into the orifice of the sprinkler. Why? No idea. But it effectively plugs, or at least partially plugs, the opening. Or maybe it's a hose screen with organic matter. And this is an easy fix. It's always impressive when you can show the grower what the problem is right off the bat. It's usually the last one or two hose lines in the manifold. And all you do is open it up, clean out the screen, and the pressure goes back up to where it should be. If it's bad enough, though, the whole line may be impacted, and then you have a bigger problem. Or maybe it's a new system, and there are plastic shavings effectively plugging things up. The installers laying pipe aren't always careful about cleaning out the pipe before gluing them together. Once they lay it in the trench and cover it up, there's no way of knowing until you turn the water on. It could be dirty water, or in this case, it looks pretty muddy. I had one situation where I opened the end of a hose and nothing came out for a couple minutes. And then all of a sudden, it started oozing out the end of the hose. And he told me he hadn't flushed it in probably a year. It was pretty bad. And going back to the flush outs I talked about earlier when I was looking at the diagram, it's hard to flush the lines when you can't even find them. This one took us a while to locate, and it was obvious that the irrigator hadn't opened it in a while. So what did that line look like? So once we've made all the measurements and observations and run the numbers to generate a DU, what are some things that can be done to improve the overall system performance? What kind of maintenance needs to take place? Well, considering what we observed at the filter station and what we saw in the field, typical recommendations might include trim the pump impellers if there's too much pressure, because pressure is energy and energy is money. Clean the cone screen, because that can reduce pressure to the field. Reset regulating valves to make sure that pressures are consistent across the block. Clean and replace hose screens. Open flush outs more often. Replace plugged emitters. Repair leaky valves. Need be, flush the hoses more often. Maybe inject acid or chlorine if you've got a lot of plugging going on, depending on the nature of the emitter plugging. And make sure the emitter types are consistent. If these measures are undertaken on a regular ongoing basis, there's no reason why the system shouldn't be operating at a high level of efficiency. So, if we look at the results of 30 plus years of testing, this is what we see. We looked at over 2,600 microsystems since 1988. And if you add in this year, 2020, which isn't completed yet, that's another 120 tests or so. Also, something else I think is noteworthy, if you look at the last 8 to 9 years, the number of drip systems tested has increased substantially over microsprinklers, with 3 times as many drip systems over sprinklers in 2020. If we look at irrigation system uniformity, or DU, we can see how systems have improved over time. More so in drip than in microsprinklers, with the overall uniformity in drip systems increasing 14% from 77 to 91 in the time frame shown on the screen, as opposed to microsprinklers increasing only 5 percentage points from 81 to 86%. I would attribute the significant increase in drip DU to the use of pressure compensating, or PC emitters, which have become more prevalent over the last 30 years. And what, you may or may not ask, is a pressure compensating emitter? PCs have a diaphragm inside that opens and closes as the pressure goes up or down, allowing the same amount of water to pass through the orifice regardless of what the pressure is. But if a grain of sand or something else gets stuck in the diaphragm and doesn't allow it to close as the pressure goes up, then more water will pass through, effectively throwing off the uniformity of the system, depending on how many emitters are impacted by whatever is causing the problem. But aside from PC emitters, which are uncommon in a microsprinkler setting, probably the most important factor in maintaining a good DU are the measures I talked about earlier, or the maintenance of the system that needs to take place. And just to reiterate, this includes making sure everything is running properly at the filter station, the pressure regulating valves are functioning properly, there are no obstructions in getting water to the field, emitters aren't plugged, leaks are addressed, hose lines are free of dirt and debris, and using acid or chlorine when necessary, if at all possible. So if the irrigator is out there doing his or her job, there's no reason that a system can't maintain a high level of uniformity. Thank you.